Disney has been making animated feature-length films for almost 80 years, and in that time, obviously, the films have changed an awful lot, and a lot of these changes can be grouped into categories. So a lot of Disney fans have come to know these groupings as the Disney eras. So today I thought I would explain to you what the Disney eras were, why they happened, and what they include. Buckle in though, because we are covering 80 years of Disney history, so it's going to be quite a long one, I imagine. Whilst the beginning and ending film of an era and also the dates can change a little bit, my idea of the eras tends to follow a pretty standardised version of the Disney eras, so if you do disagree with any, then please let me know in the comments. The eras are all open to interpretation, this is just my understanding of them. The first era is known as the Golden Age, and it of course started with Snow White all the way back in 1937. This was closely followed by Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo and Bambi. The films generally had a magical, wholesome feel to them that was kind of upbeat, but every now and then there'd be these random dark, really dark scenes thrown in, and this also garnered the Golden Age a second name, the Sugar and Tar era. All of these films were overseen by Walt himself and were traditionally hand animated. But the term golden is actually really misleading because aside from Snow White, which was obviously a success, a lot of the films in this era were kind of box office flops. Fantasia and Pinocchio were wonderfully animated. They're still held up as like pinnacles of animation today, but they were also really expensive to make, and this put Disney's animation department almost on the verge of bankruptcy. And to try and prevent this bankruptcy, Disney turned Dumbo, which was originally just going to be a short, into a feature-length, well, 1 hour 4 minute film to try and recuperate some of the funds. This era really utilised the multiplane technique, which is where they get a bunch of cells and they've all got like the different drawings on, so that you can almost have a 3D effect of a camera zooming in through a scene, and it makes it feel that little bit more real. Sorry, Drake. You okay? Obviously the Disney company had been going on for a while before they decided to make Snow White, but Snow White signalled the start of a pretty heavy dispute. Throughout making the shorts before Snow White and also during the process of Snow White, the studio had become a kind of utopia for Walt. He considered all his animators to be his family, so it came as a massive shock to him when in 1941 there was an animation strike. Now this wasn't specific to Disney, but Disney was impacted hard by this. Disney's workers weren't generally underpaid. The issue was that the top animators were getting $500 a week and the lower were getting $12 a week. They were all promised bonuses for when Snow White was finished because it was such a big project and all the animators were working overtime. But when Snow White had this massive success, all the animators got was, well, the top animators got more money and the lower animators were basically fired. So obviously this didn't make for happy workers. Walt did feel very betrayed by this, and you can kind of see how he felt about it in the scene in Dumbo where all the clowns are talking about going to the big boss for a raid. It's kind of like a snide little
oh, we're gonna hit the big boss for a raid. Yes, we're gonna hit the big boss for a raid.
So in an attempt to escape, and also with the onset of World War II, Walt decided to go travelling in South America, hailing in the next Disney era. The onset of World War II, coupled with the loss of animators due to the strike, meant that budgets and animators available at the Disney studios were quite limited. With the arrival of World War II, feature-length animation kind of stopped at Disney, and instead they focused on making package films, which is another name for the era, that brought a load of shorts together. The films of this era were heavily influenced by Walt's travels in South America. This era included, and I'm probably going to butcher this, Saludos Amigos, The Three Caballeros, Make My Music, Fun and Fancy Free, Melody Time and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. These tend to be the films that people don't really know, some people don't even count them within the Disney eras, but it's interesting to know. The films of the wartime era also helped to make sure that South America joined the American forces and not the Nazis, which is probably a good thing. Once the war was over, budgets returned, then we get the Silver Age. And this era includes Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians, Sword in the Stone, and The Jungle Book. This age saw Disney's return to feature-length animation, and this is when they really started ramping up the fairy tale aspect and kind of having this magical, otherworldly feel to their films. You can see this in some of the backgrounds of the time. A lot of the cells actually ended up being sold as standalone artwork, so that kind of shows you the level of detail. Unfortunately, as with many of the eras, there was one big flop, and that was Sleeping Beauty. Sleeping Beauty performed so badly at the box office that they considered shutting the animation department down. This was a really important in Disney history because it's kind of the moment that Walt decided to shift all his efforts towards his parks. It's 1959, you know, Disneyland's opened, he's starting to think about the Florida project, and the animation department needed to find a way to make the films cheaper. And this cheap way of making things came along in the form of xerography. So before 101 Dalmatians, animation kind of looked like this. Animators would draw their characters on paper. 24 of these drawings are required for 1 second of finished animation. Drawings are then transferred from the animation department to the ink and paint department, where the animators' lines are meticulously traced out by the talented artists in the department onto cells. The cells are then photographed and then they're played in quick succession, and the illusion is that the drawings are then moving. Now obviously this was quite time consuming. Xerography wasn't. It was basically a form of dry photocopying, and it's why a lot of the films after Sleeping Beauty have this kind of scratchy, sketchy feel to them. While some people did really like this style, it did kind of compromise the quality, and a lot of those ornate backgrounds that people had come to associate with Disney over the past decade kind of fizzled into non-existence. Then of course Walt Disney passed away in 1961, and this kind of left the animation studio without the guidance obviously of someone that had overseen all the films before. It was also a time that we now associate with kind of poor cultural understanding, and it's because they were going to these mystical far off places but they still had an American audience, and it meant that they kind of placed plot lines in these far off places but then completely Americanized the places. So like Jungle Book, there's not really much Asian culture in there. And Peter Pan, well, there's parts of Peter Pan we don't like to talk about very much. The transitional era. Because it was an era of transition. You can see by the movies they produced that they were trying a load of different things, trying to find their identity without Walt. It included the Aristocats, Robin Hood, Winnie the Pooh, The Rescuers, Fox and the Hound, The Black Cauldron, The Great Mouse Detective, and Oliver and Company. This is also known as the Bronze Age or the Dark Age. Now some people think it's called the Dark Age because of the financial flops that they had. Animation department was not doing that well. But I think it's actually referred to as the Dark Age because of the content of the films. They kind of strayed away from that fairy tale vibe and went for a lot darker, grittier, well, as gritty as Disney gets, storylines. In particular, you can look at The Black Cauldron, which is the only Disney animated film to be given a PG rating. So that should tell you pretty much all you need to know. They were still using xerography a lot at this time, so a lot of the films again have that scratchy feel to them, and quite a few of the animators, and one in particular, Don Bluth, decided to leave Disney because they felt that it didn't represent the Disney that they'd signed up to. You know, these people that were always pushing the boundaries of animation, now it just kind of seemed like they were just hanging on. They just needed some kind of success to rebalance them, but it compromised the storytelling and the animation and led to a lot of people leaving. If you think you recognise the name Don Bluth, it's because he is the guy behind All Dogs Go to Heaven, Land Before Time, Secret of NIMH, all of those sort of, you'll recognise them, it's a very specific brand. Pixar by this time had started making short films, so CGI was kind of coming into the realms of animation. You also had Don Bluth over here doing insanely well, and the turning point came when American Tail, which was a Don Bluth film, outperformed The Mouse Detective, and The Land Before Time outperformed Oliver and Company. There needed to be a shake-up. So the animation department was basically exiled. and they were told that they would not be able to come back to their animation building because they'd just been put in this warehouse until they fixed things, essentially. They also used a lot of reused frames at this time, just again to save money. To make this era even more difficult for Disney, they actually faced a corporate takeover at this time. Essentially, it was doing so poorly that the shareholders of Disney decided that it would actually be more worth their while to kind of chop up the company and sell off the parts. Luckily, Walt's nephew, Roy E. Disney, kind of fought against this, and he also fought to keep the animation department open because a lot of people at this time just said, close it, it's gone, it's over lads, it's over. But he was like, no, I believe in it, we can pull this back. And you know what they did? They combated the takeover and they ended up with two new CEOs of Disney who planned to just turn it all around. This was Michael Eisner and Frank Wells. Eisner you probably will have heard a lot of. He's responsible for some of the best things to happen to Disney and also some of the worst things. I'm looking at you, alien. But it led to one of my favourite eras, the one I love and I grew up with, the Disney Renaissance. Renaissance literally means rebirth, and we would not have had said rebirth if we hadn't had the figurative death of Disney in the Dark Age. The Disney Renaissance included The Little Mermaid, The Rescuers Down Under, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, Pocahontas, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hercules, Mulan and Tarzan. At this point, Disney decided to go back to its fairy tales that seemed to perform so well, and that's why obviously you get things like The Little Mermaid, and they also decided to implement a Broadway formula, meaning that when they were making the films, the idea was that any of the single films could have been turned into a Broadway musical. That's why you get very similar songs in each of these films. You know, your side character gets a song, you get the I Want song from your lead protagonist. During the Disney Renaissance, Pixar kind of picked up its game. It started making feature lengths with Toy Story in 1995, so they had that competitor. There were also other animation departments starting to spring up here and there. DreamWorks had also started up in 1994 with Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was one of Disney's former employees. Again, he was kind of walked over by Michael Eisner, but that's a story for another day. So they've got DreamWorks going on, they've got Pixar going on, so Disney is upping its game. Obviously, loads of these films were box office hits, and it was also helped that animation was made cheaper. Later on in the game, Disney and Pixar kind of crossed paths a little more. Pixar helped develop the CAD system, which was first used in Beauty and the Beast. Now, the CAD system allowed the cells that they made to be scanned onto the computers and manipulated through the computers. So that's where we get that wonderful ballroom scene in Beauty and the Beast, and it was used more heavily, obviously, after Beauty and the Beast. It just helped to make things way quicker. They also started trying to represent cultures a little more. They got it wrong a few times, they got it right a few times, but things like the opening of The Lion King, if they hadn't used Zulu music, if they'd said it in English, it would have been way less effective. I mean, you just have to look at that transition from that to when they flip into the English and they have to change the whole melody and everything. I mean, that's kind of why it's so hard to get cultural music right, is because not all cultures treat music the same as us. They have obviously emphasis on different syllables, their own sounds. Some don't sing as such, they use what are called vocables. It's a very complicated issue and it's one for a different video, but at this time Disney was kind of, you know, dabbling a little bit more. They had stronger women. If you look at Mulan, she's kind of the epitome of that. They also had more sensitive moments with the men. But yeah, no film really flopped completely. Obviously some did better than others, but generally this was quite a lucrative era for Disney. Tarzan brought in the millennium with something called the deep canvas effect, which was quite similar to the multiplane thing that I talked about earlier, but it was on a computer, and that's how we can see him like going through all the vines and everything. It's that layering effect again, and this was again another big mark in animation and followed throughout the films, yada 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 yada. Now we come on to what is creatively known as the post-Renaissance. This started at the beginning of the millennium and it included Fantasia 2000, Dinosaur, The Emperor's New Groove, Atlantis, Lilo and Stitch, Treasure Planet, Brother Bear,
Home on the Range and Chicken Little.
This era actually has a lot of similarities to the Dark Era, with the onslaught of CGI being used in animation studios around them, particularly if you look at DreamWorks and Pixar. Disney decided that they needed to go into a new way of storytelling. So again, there's a lot of trial and error with these films. You can see how different each one is. And you can also see them trying their hand with their first CGI film, which was Dinosaur. A lot of films in this era did not do well at the box office, aside from maybe Lilo and Stitch, which ironically was made on the cheap. The story with Lilo and Stitch is kind of the same as Dumbo. Dumbo came after two very expensive films, Fantasia and Pinocchio, and so was made on the cheap with like watercolour backgrounds. They did the exact same for Lilo and Stitch, that's why it has such a unique art style. It hadn't been used since Dumbo, and it was probably the most lucrative of all the films within that era. And they kind of steered away from the fairy tales at this point and started going into more sci-fi. It's important to note as well that Disney was competing with some pretty big franchises at this point, i.e. Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, which obviously did not help things and took a lot of the box office sales. And now we come into our present era, which I don't think anyone's really decided on a name. It's known as like the Second Renaissance, the Revival. Let's name it today! Write in the comments what you think this era should be called, and I shall therefore refer to it, maybe, as your era.
Included
Princess and the Frog, Tangled, Winnie the Pooh, Wreck-It Ralph, Frozen, Big Hero 6, Zootopia and Moana. That's all we've had so far, right? Am I missing something? I feel like I'm missing something. So in 2007, Pixar's John Lasseter took over the animation department, and therefore that's why we've got a lot of CGI films in this era. It's because Pixar and Disney have kind of completed their merge. They have reached their final form. We do have some more traditionally animated films with Princess and the Frog and Winnie the Pooh, but this kind of leads on to how they came to a nice little midpoint. They've basically found a way now to merge CGI with normal drawings, so they kind of draw them out first, and then they kind of use a similar system to the CAD, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, and then they can CGI it from the CAD drawing? I think that's kind of what they do. It's found this nice midpoint where it doesn't kind of step into the uncanny valley, and they can have that Disney charm in, but then they also get the suave of Pixar. It's wonderful. They've also shifted back to the musicals that were so popular during the Renaissance era. You see, this is why you know the eras, because now I can just say the Renaissance era and you know kind of where I'm talking. Other technical advances included the Hyperion system in Big Hero 6, which lets them do all the funky Tron lighting, and it's why Baymax is kind of see-through a little bit and he looks so squishy. They're finally starting to understand how to integrate culture into their films without offending people. A great example of this comes from Moana, and praise be to Lin, the genius musical composer behind it. They actually celebrate the cultural gap for once, and instead of all that Pocahontas magic stuff, they actually use music as a common language and use it to transition between, you know, you as the English-speaking audience member into the world of Motunui, of Tokelauan, I think that's the language. I'm really sorry if I've said that wrong. But it's really interesting how they switch languages within the songs. It's a really good way of doing it, and I think the next hurdle for Disney is going to be sexuality. They're starting to kind of put out like feelers about it, so I think that's going to be the next thing they cover. Regardless of the era, Disney has provided us with social commentary, music that we've loved, characters that we've loved, and also plots that kind of inspire us to follow our dreams and, you know, all that magical wanky stuff. But I'm ever thankful that the animation department managed to stay open, what with all the strikes and the threatenings of closings and the different people running it, and just props to you, animation department, well done. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I make a new video every week, and there's certainly going to be a lot more Disney content on this channel. When I told people I was going to be talking about the Disney eras, a lot of people wanted to know about the technical side and the political side, so I tried to like fit it all in. So I'm sorry if it was a bit of a long one, but obviously, you know, this thing leads to this thing and this thing leads to this thing, so meh. Anyway, thank you for seeing it all the way through, and I hope to speak to you really soon. Bye!
Saludos amigos.
Saludos amigos.